to announce is Ms. Lakshmi Landa. Ms. Landa has taught hypnobirthing as a method for peaceful natural childbirth since 2003, as well as prenatal, postnatal, and water yoga. With her husband, she managed the Shanti Yoga Ashram spiritual food community, supported agriculture, and the School of Life with its many service programs where people work, study, and practice a spiritual lifestyle. In 2006, the Ascended Church of Peace was founded to further the work of spiritual development of those committed to understand the transcendence to their next step of existence. Her talk will be Parental Preparation for the Incarnating Soul. Please join me in welcome Ms. Landa at this time.
Thank you. And I'll do what everyone did. Can you hear me? The back? Okay. Great. Well, thanks for coming back from the break to hear this next talk, which is following on the footsteps of what Wendy spoke of about the sentient nature of the unborn child, or the incarnating soul. And with my work with childbirth education, I wanted to focus on the practical side here today, preparing parents, and how we as a community can prepare for the incarnating souls. So as we heard today already from Wendy, Dr. McCarty, and Dr. Doi, we know that the incarnation process, conception, pregnancy, and birth, the spirit has perception. And there's different kinds of perception, different levels, perhaps. Not all babies are the same. But the important thing that is that as parents, as family and friends of pregnant couples, and as healthcare workers especially, we can be aware of that presence. We can connect with it, and yes, we can even influence it. And that's what we're going to talk about, some of those ways we can do that. But before, I wanted to also ask questions to you, like the others have. And first of all, who here in the room is a parent? Many people, right. And maybe a grandparent, or an aunt or an uncle. And then has anybody known anybody closely through a pregnancy, followed somebody, either a relative or a coworker, or through your profession, followed somebody closely in pregnancy? So again, the majority of the audience has had some experience of connecting with people during the incarnation process. And basically, most of us in society at some point will encounter a pregnancy. And now that we know of the consciousness of the unborn and how the environment impacts and shapes the patterns for the life to come, as we heard so eloquently spoken earlier, we can be attentive to avoiding negative influence and influencing that life in a positive way. So what I'd like to do with this short time is to talk about some of the positive influence we can have on the incarnating soul, to address the factors that we know from prenatal psychology that are highly influential on that development. So, there's 4 areas I'm going to mention, which are the same 4 areas that Dr. McCarty mentioned: conception, pregnancy, birth, and after the birth. And in between that, woven into that, I'm going to mention 3 different techniques that really apply to all areas, to the whole process: spiritual tools, pre-birth parenting, and bonding. So we'll start with conception or preconception. And the question here is, what can parents do? Practical things. We know there definitely will be an influence in these different areas, so we want to make it a positive influence. So first, parents can work on themselves. And then they can work with the soul of the incoming soul, envisioning the ideal soul they would like to attract. And then set about preparing a welcoming environment for that unborn child. And that includes working on themselves and their physical health as well. Even if, and especially if the pregnancy was unplanned. We want to create the environment so the soul feels welcome. I'd like to just spend a little bit of extra time on the first point, working on yourselves. What does it mean, work on yourself? Well, we have some words from different perspectives. First is Master Omar Michael Ivanov, who is a Western spiritual teacher. And he has a book called Education Begins Before Birth. And he says he was often asked that question by parents or by pregnant couples, parent couples preparing to have a child, what can I do to prepare? And he says the best way to answer is to make sure that your thoughts and feelings, indeed your whole attitude and way of life, are such as to attract exceptional beings into your family. So he's saying that we can influence the soul that incarnates. And we know that there's great wisdom in indigenous cultures. And we can hear from Sabanfu Some, who comes to us from Burkina Faso, and she was destined to take their traditions to the West, and her name means keeper of the rituals. And she says, in my tribe, even before you conceive, there are a lot of things you have to do to get ready for the child. Sort out your own mess, so you don't have to transfer it onto the children. So this wisdom has been there throughout the ages. And then, bringing us up to the modern time, we hear from Dr. McCarthy herself. This quote comes from her book, and she's talking about the model imperative principle, saying, prominent in today's early development literature, the mother's state of being is seen to be the model, which the baby's brain and system come into a dynamic relationship with and utilizes to build their own. Very interesting from the scientific point. And finally, we have some words from Ayurveda that sort of bring these two together, these two concepts. The ancient medical science of Ayurveda, which comes from India, tells us that the parent's own condition, their emotional, mental, and physical state at the time of conception, can influence what soul is attracted, as well as have lifelong effects on the health of their child. That sums up what we have heard so far. So when we talk about working on yourself, we're talking about preparing for that moment of conception, to attract a high soul and to bring the best health effects to it. Ayurveda gives great importance to preparation of both partners, the mother and the father. And speaking of the spiritual preparation, we'd just like to talk about some spiritual tools that parents can use. And most of these you're probably familiar with, but if you know parents, people who are thinking of having a child or who are pregnant, these are the things that we can encourage them to do to prepare for that best experience of that incarnating soul. Meditation, clearing your mind, keeping things in perspective, visualizing a positive pregnancy, positive birth, bonding, and a happy child, which is so important, not only during the preconception and the pregnancy, but all through the early stages of the child's life. Visualizing that child is an important part of the preparation for that child's future. Prayer is important. And then, of course, trust and surrender, understanding that divine plan, and so we don't worry, putting it in God's hands. And here's a picture of close to conception. This child is almost fully formed, but it's just about six or 8 weeks. And next, the second point is peaceful pregnancy. Having a peaceful pregnancy is the positive way we can influence the incarnating soul. Pregnancy is a unique time when women feel motivation to work on self-improvement. So for the sake of the baby, mothers should first and foremost nurture their spirit, connect with the sacred side of pregnancy. Continue whatever spiritual practices she's comfortable with, connect with like-minded people. And on this, I want to divert a little bit and say that there's plenty of resources available for women to connect with. But it's very important that she's selective. There's an overwhelming amount of information. If any of you remember from your pregnancies or people that you were connected with, there's an enormous amount of information there. The internet, bookstores, libraries, and lots of advice, unsolicited advice, right? Remember people telling you or, giving you suggestions. Whether it's about the pregnancy or about the birth or about raising your children. Lots of advice comes. And some of it is good, and some of it is maybe not so good. So we have to be very careful what a pregnant mother feeds her mind. We're talking about this incarnating soul, and we heard before about how the strong connection that the mother has with the child. So we have to be selective about what we read and what we watch on TV and what we listen to. In fact, this button we hand out to our class students in our classes. It says, "Please, only happy birth stories. My baby is listening." And the next thing I want to talk about, or just ask a question, actually. Speaking of, whoops, I'm going to back up a minute. Speaking of peaceful birth, which is fourth down on this list, I just want to ask you if you can try to think back to when you were pregnant, or when you've known somebody who was pregnant, or even just any time in your life, if you have ever heard about birth stories. Has anybody here heard stories of other people telling their experiences? Usually most of us have, especially if we're pregnant. Lots of stories come to us. What about the media? Anybody seen a birth story in the media? Right. Well, I ask that question in my class all the time. And, no, sorry, I'm going to back up for a minute. If it was an animal birth, we always think of, when I hear the question is, have you seen a birth story? We think of humans. But if it was an animal birth, let's step back and think if we've ever seen one of those. It was probably very peaceful and very quiet. If it was a human birth, in the media especially, it was probably not so quiet and not so peaceful. The media likes to show drama. But as we said before, it's very important what a pregnant woman feeds her mind. So it's important that she avoids drama, whether it's from whatever source. And now I want to go back to hearing stories from others. If we've heard birth stories, we want to, happy birth, let me see, where am I here? So we're going to go on to the next topic, which is pre-birth parenting, because this connects as well, and it can be done at all stages. And pre-birth parenting is also called prenatal bonding. And basically, these are activities that can connect with the baby and tell your baby that she is welcome and wanted, and also offers an opportunity for the parents for growth and development. So what kinds of things are we talking about? What kinds of things can parents do to connect with their baby before it's born? Well, they should be aware of the kind of environment and experiences they're providing to their unborn baby. They can offer love and play and music to reinforce positive feelings, and definitely avoid negative experiences, loud noises, disturbing noises, yelling, screaming, emotional upsets. All of that is being listened to by the baby, who's experiencing everything that the mother experiences. In terms of preparing a welcoming environment, parents can nurture each other, giving the message that this is a loving family. Get older children involved, talk to the baby, read to the child, and get them connected with the unborn that's coming into their family. Prenatal psychology reports that babies are often calmer, happier, and better adjusted to life outside the womb when parents have done these activities, as we see in the slides here: teasing, nurturing, rubbing, squeezing, talking, telling stories, playing music. We want to focus specifically on talking to the baby because parents will say, well, what should I say? Baby's not here, what do I say? Well, you don't have to be a medium to talk to the baby, but you should try to talk out loud, because even though baby's consciousness is telepathic, as we've already heard today, so there's no need for concern about language or even words, but words are very powerful. We hear that especially from the spiritual teachings. So speaking out loud has a specifically strong effect. So we recommend talking to the baby about their daily activity, about what's going on. You can read to them. In a quiet, receptive state, you can ask the baby if it needs anything, and you may receive an intuition that makes sense, that's something that was missing in your pregnancy, your experience, and then act on that. In any challenging situation, you can give the baby reassurance to let the baby know that for example, stress has happened. Stress happens. There's loss, there's grief, there's accidents that will happen during a pregnancy. We try our best to provide a peaceful environment, but we can't avoid everything. But we do want to make sure the baby doesn't feel like it's its fault, similar to the story we heard earlier about that 4-year-old child who thought it was his fault. We want to give the baby reassurance that these things happen and everything will be okay, and we'll just get through this difficult experience. And I'm talking, of course, about the unborn baby. This is during the pregnancy. So what is just sort of summarize this? Marie Mangan, who is the founder of the hypnobirthing program, she sort of summarizes in her book that in terms of giving advice to the parents about ways that you can connect with your child and what are the benefits. And basically, the summary is, and these come from the studies of the same doctors and researchers that we heard mentioned earlier. PreBirth parenting proactively begins the relationship between the parent and the child. And there are many, many benefits, just a few listed here. Specifically for the baby, for example, there's fewer premature births when their parents bond with their babies before birth. Babies cry less. And on the parental side, parents can be more relaxed, more confident about the pregnancy and the birth and about parenting itself. So pre-birth parenting makes a difference. The studies have shown this. The book, The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, that Dr. McCarthy mentioned, has lots of studies referenced about these kinds of activities and their results. And here's a simple picture of a father very happily connecting with his unborn child. And next, we're going to talk about birth. We move on to the birth experience itself, keeping in mind that we're talking about incarnating souls. Birth matters. The birth experience is particularly poignant experience because the consciousness is entering into that body and it leaves an indelible imprint on the child. This has been shown again and again and again in the prenatal psychology literature and in the studies. And this quote I put here because it's not, I want to just broaden this. It's about the child, it's about the parents, it's about the family, and it's actually about the world that they're coming into. Suzanne Arms, who is a pioneer and for decades working in the world of birthing, and she's created a concept in an organization called Birthing the Future. She says, if we hope to create a nonviolent world where respect and kindness replace fear and hatred, we must begin with how we treat each other at the beginning of life. For that is where our deepest patterns are set. From these roots grow fear and alienation, or love and trust. So what is birth? Is it frightening, or is it peaceful? We're going to talk a little bit about peaceful birth, and I'd like to give an example of what peaceful birth looks like, because maybe some of us haven't had that experience to see it, especially if our birth experiences of birth are limited to what the media shows us. A peaceful birth, and this experience comes from my own, these come from, what I'm going to read here, describe, comes from my own experience as a childbirth educator, what I hear that the parents tell me after they give birth. First, labor starts, mother and father happily share the news. Mother labors at home until her body signals it's time to go. She quietly breathes up through her contractions, which we call surges. Contraction is a restricting word, and creates tension, and we're trying to relax. So we change the name to surge, a wave of love that comes through the mother to bring the baby into her life. The way they breathe enhances the effectiveness of the surges, and then she smiles after every surge. The companion is there, usually the father, sometimes other family members or friends. Light touch, soft voice, other comfort measures to support the mother as she's going through the labor. If there's any conversation in the room, she initiates it. The room is very quiet otherwise. Her face shows the relaxed state of her mind and body. Sometimes it looks like she's sleeping. She's so quiet. If you've seen animal births, this is what I'm talking about. The mother and father will talk to the baby throughout the labor and birth, including the baby in the whole process. When the birthing time comes, she gently refocuses her breath downwards to assist the birth process. There's no pushing involved. And then in a dim, quiet, and relaxed environment, the baby emerges slowly, quietly. The baby is immediately put onto the mother's body, skin to skin. The father touches, and the beautiful bonding process begins. Sometimes the mothers who go through this kind of experience, well, they always say that it was more manageable than it would have been had they not been trained, had they not known that it could be like that. and not practiced it beforehand. And in some cases even, they'll report there was no pain at all. So what can parents do to have this kind of a peaceful birth? Well, we've talked about some of these things already. The fourth one on the list, I'll mention that professional caregivers honoring the family's wishes. That's very important, that in advance the parents prepare with the caregivers to have the kind of birth that they're looking for. And then allowing patience and using patience to allow nature to take its course. Unless, of course, there's a medical emergency, and then everyone cooperates in whatever way is necessary. From the baby's point of view, we need to talk about birth from the baby's point of view. We know the baby has a point of view. We know that from our earlier presentation. To make the baby's transition less traumatic, we want to protect their sensory encounters, give them a chance to breathe on their own, and don't interrupt the critical bonding with their parents in any way, unless it's absolutely necessary from a medical standpoint. And this information first came to us from the work of Frederick Leboyer, first into our modern society, I should say, first came to us back in the 1970s. He was a French obstetrician who was unhappy with the way he was seeing babies being born and the compromised situations they were coming into in terms of their health and the tortured look on their faces. So he set about looking for a new way, and when he implemented some of these new ways to invite the baby into the world at the moment of birth, he found that babies didn't necessarily cry. And their faces changed from tortured and irritated to something more composed and occasionally even smiles. So some of you may be familiar with his work called Birth Without Violence. And this, I have a copy of the book, which I'll be having a table a little bit today. There's not much time after this presentation, but it'll be here tomorrow as well. And you can see lots of pictures of babies smiling at the moment of birth and during that bonding experience. And that's what I want to talk about next, is after the birth. The fourth opportunity for positive influence on the incarnating soul is in these first 1 to 2 hours after the birth, which is a very unique time for the mother and the baby. Any interruption of that can affect the complex and delicate hormonal balance that could potentially affect the mother's experience and the baby's experience in terms of their health, in terms of their relationship. Even affects the mother's ability sometimes to feel confident in her maternal behavior. There's lots of studies that have shown that if the mother does not bond immediately at the moment of birth, she may not feel as comfortable. And even a mother at the beginning who may start out not feeling confident in her mothering abilities, if she's able to bond with the baby, she just naturally falls into that role and learns to love the baby and connect right from the start. So we're talking about keeping your baby with you at the moment of birth, without interruption. And we hear here from Barbara Findesine, who was also an expert in the field in many different ways, like Dr. McCarthy. And she says, it's really important to keep your baby with you, even if, and especially if there's been a trauma. And this is important for the healthcare providers who are here or those you know, because it heals the baby, lowers stress hormones, and brings endorphins. It's a sacred moment and should not be violated unless, of course, there's a medical emergency. So that means even when there is some treatment that is necessary, put the baby on the mother, keep her there, and do your treatment around that environment as much as possible. And you'll actually get better results, better healing results. And there's one other very good example of this called, maybe some of you have heard of this, called Kangaroo Mother Care. And this study from the Oxford Journal says that it's the first published meta-analysis showing that kangaroo mother care actually reduces neonatal mortality amongst preterm babies. What is it? It's basically putting the baby on the mother, wrapping her skin to skin, and the mother is kind of like getting back inside the womb. And they'll do this right inside the nurseries. Sometimes babies can go home early if they stabilize. But what they find in either case is that the babies will progress more rapidly in their growth and development and in their healing. So what we've been talking about here is bonding. Bonding takes place at all stages, even preconception, conception, during the pregnancy, during the birth, talking to the baby, and those first minutes and hours after the birth. This bonding experience is very, very vital for the health and well-being of the child and their parents. What is bonding? Well, it's a scientifically proven mind-body connection and mother-infant connection. And it has multiple effects on the baby, on the mother, and on all of society. We're going to hear a little bit more about that next from some of the specialists in the field. First, David Chamberlain, who we've already been introduced to today. He wrote a paper in 1995 called Birth and the Origins of Violence, and this quote comes from that. He says, "In every program which has been empirically tested, the efforts of parents to communicate love and welcome to their babies in the womb has been crowned with success. A prominent benefit has been the creation of strong, mutual parent-child relationships. In the prenatal and perinatal period of time, the anger and violence are natural products of rejection," he's talking about maternal rejection, "and separation from the mother and father. Security and peace are the natural products of communication and love." There's a body of groundbreaking work that shows how the field of socioeconomic interaction between a mother and her infant is essential to brain development, to the emergence of consciousness, and the formation of a healthy self-concept. This comes from the research of the HeartMath Institute and an article called Resonant Heart by Dr. Roland McCraty, which is actually also one of the appendixes in Dr. McCarty's book, Welcoming Consciousness. And you can learn more about it there. And another scientific approach, this is from an obstetrician, Michel Odent, who studied very carefully about the experiences of the whole prenatal work by comparing studies. He was in the 80s, because of the explosion of computers technology, he was able to cross-reference studies. That this hadn't not been done before. And they found that that we now have scientific data that suggests answers as to how the capacity to love develops. And he developed a concept and a book called The Scientification of Love. He says the data converge to give great importance to early experiences, particularly to a short critical period immediately after birth. So that's the scientific data to support the evidence of what we see when the babies are able to be with their parents versus when there's a separation. So, back to the practical side. What can parents do to enhance the bonding experience at birth? Well, everything we've mentioned so far. And in addition to that, as much as possible to have a drug-free birth, because that greatly enhances the mother and baby's ability to bond. We all know what happens when we take drugs. It affects us physically and mentally. We don't feel ourselves. So when it's possible, to reduce that influence or eliminate it completely. Here's some pictures of bonding at birth. We saw a lot of pictures before from the happy scene. And so we'll go to the next slide here. And just mention that, as we know, if we're talking about after birth experiences, we have to consider that sometimes things don't always go well. Birth complications, rejection, extended separations, and the like. The important thing is don't blame anyone. Don't blame ourselves. Don't blame mothers. Don't blame doctors. Don't blame the baby. As we heard from Dr. McCarty, after the birth effects can be anytime, even years after. And now that we know about the impact of the prenatal and perinatal experiences, it's also natural for us as parents, caregivers, whatever, even as human beings thinking on our own birth experiences, we often may start to wonder, did I do something wrong? Or was something wrong done to me? That often comes as a result of a discussion like what we're having today. So again, we need to go back. Don't blame. Whatever happened, happened for a reason. It's in the past. And we can talk about the ways we can heal that now. Another thing to keep in mind, as we heard from Dr. Doi, especially about the work of Michael Newton and Ellen Kardec, that in planning for reincarnation, spirits, and their guides design what is best for that next learning experience. So our job is to do our best, but we know that it's not all in our hands. And that helps us to avoid the blame and the guilt. From a spiritual perspective, we need to understand the situation as a learning experience. And as I said, recognize some incarnations will be challenging, will be more difficulty than others, and that cultivating the natural love of parent-child relations will maximize the opportunity for healing at all those levels. Compassion, love, and forgiveness heals. Whether the child is an infant, a 6-month-old, a 6-year-old, or a 36-year-old adult, it's never too late to heal. And here's a beautiful picture of a baby right after birth, in bliss. And I'm just going to go very quickly through the end now because the time is short. There is an impact on the community, as we talked about, the whole love and violence question. I'm going to skip this one, and we have 2 examples from Dr. McCarthy's work. She talked already about the 12 guiding principles, and of course all the work in her book that's presented about how the community can influence the incarnating souls. And here's a perspective from Omer Michael Ivanov again. He says, if the state, instead of spending billions on hospitals, prisons, law courts, and schools, would concentrate all its attention on pregnant mothers, the cost would be far less and the results infinitely superior. He really believes in this work, and I think most of us here do too. In closing, I just want to honor the pioneers of this work, as we've been hearing about this whole day. Also honor each incarnating soul and the creation process itself, because this work just brings us all together. And the best expression of gratitude is to put into practice what we've learned. For the baby's future, to prevent trauma and support the human potential, their highest potential. For the family, to strengthen the relationships. And for society, to overcome violence, to bring love to society and to our mother planet Earth, and for the evolution of humanity as a whole. We're talking, as I said at the beginning, we're talking about incarnating souls. This is really a big deal. It matters. Birth matters. This whole incarnating process matters. This knowledge has enormous implications and enormous opportunity. And I just want to close with a quote from Joseph Chilton Pearce, who's now 88 years old, and after a lifetime, another one of the pioneers in this work, after a lifetime of work in human and child development, he says, I think one of the most exciting things about the 20th century is coming into full awareness of what's involved in the birth process. And I think so too. Thank you.